Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody to the December edition of the PastorCast. The PastorCast is a monthly podcast for pastors and church leaders. The PastorCast is brought to you by Service Realty. Service Realty is a church real estate professionals based out of Plano, Texas. And we bring the PastorCast to you, the pastors and church leaders that we've developed relationships with, to talk about topics that are relevant to the church and pastors as they go about the business of running a church and building buildings and financing and vision and all these things. We've had this year in 2016, just as we wrap up, we've had some great pastor casts. We started off the year with Jim Tomerlin talking about multi-site trends. We'll be doing that again in January 2017. We had Will Mancini on to talk about his new book, God Dreams. It talked about raising funds with Todd McMission from Auxano. We had Lionheart, Stan Dobbs, a great ministry for churches to partner together with an intentional ministry to reach children and their families with Stan Dobbs. And so we've just had a bunch of great pastor casts this year, and we're going to wrap up 2016 with a friend, Will Heath. Will Heath is not only a friend, but he's a really smart guy. We're going to call him a guru when it comes to the field of succession planning. Will is a lead navigator with Auxano, and he is specifically helping them or kind of heading up their initiative to help churches and ministries effectively navigate seasons of transition. So, Will, you were here with us in January 2015 to talk about succession planning. And today we're going to dive deeper as you shared a post about 5 critical conversations in succession planning. So before we dive into that, let's hear from you. How are you doing?
Doing great, man. It's good to be with you again, John. Always good to see your face.
Yeah, glad to be on the PastorCast again, are you?
I am.
Well, I called you because I said, hey, we got to get this on the PastorCast because you had this post that I think really provides some meat to the word succession planning. You even said in the post that succession planning has kind of become a catchphrase for what is actually 5 distinct conversations. And so today I'd like you and I to chat through this a little bit so that those who are considering seasons of transition can actually put a little meat to the bone of what succession planning is. So before I dive into a bunch of, why don't you just give us a little bit of framework of these 5 conversations, kind of where you've been, because I know you've been working with a lot of churches around the country lately. So why don't you dive into that, and then we'll get into these 5 conversations.
Yeah, thanks, John. When the topic of succession planning first landed on my radar, somewhere around early 2007, there were actually very few ministry leaders, denominational leaders, or pastors that would even entertain a conversation related to succession planning. This is again, like local church pastors, denominational leaders. But fast forward to 2016, and the tone of where we are in the church community around the country has changed drastically. There are more and more churches, pastors and boards, elders that are wanting to have this succession planning conversation. What I've noticed over the last couple of years, as this conversation is sort of picking up steam, is that the topic of succession planning is actually being used as, like you said, a catchphrase for actually 5 different conversations. And the post that I released to the Vision Room earlier in the month of November was really just to kind of bring some structure around what are those 5 different conversations. And again, the reason for that is just working with churches and leadership teams is really interesting. People would be different people around the room, around the table in various contexts, would be saying succession planning, would be using those words, but they actually have 5 different ways they're talking about this one word of succession planning. And so I thought it'd be helpful just to articulate and delineate some of the definitions behind what we mean when we say succession planning.
Sure. Well, I do think what you've laid out here is a great, it does provide great clarity and some good language to help distinguish what people mean when they say succession planning. So let's dive right in.
Sure.
First one was intentional leadership transition. And why don't you share with us a little bit about maybe some questions that leaders that are going through succession planning as an intentional leadership transition, what are 5 of the most common questions that are asked?
Yeah, it's great. And so when leaders are having the succession planning conversation, and they're kind of in their mind, they're thinking ahead of time, maybe they're 5 to 7 years away from transitioning, and they're asking lots of questions related to, and the big idea there is, how can we prepare the church and the organizational structure and the staff and the members of the church? What can we do ahead of time to prepare for a season of transition, and use these next 5 to 7, maybe it's 4 years, just to get ready? And a couple of questions. There's really about 15 or so really high level questions that seem to come up in a lot of different contexts, and I'll just share a few of them with you. The first one, which is really, it comes up a lot, is, do we have a clear sense of what makes us unique? Churches. One of the greatest things that protects a church's sense of stability through a season of transition has to deal with absolute clarity on who they are, understanding their uniqueness, understanding their. At Auxano, we like to talk about what can you do better than 10,000 other churches. Not that you're better than 10,000 other churches, but every church is a unique collection of people, leadership passion. Even 2 churches that are geographically right down the street from one another, they still have a unique gathering of people. The leaders are passionate about certain things. And they're just, the sense of uniqueness will inform the type of profile they put together to hire a successor. And it really is an important question. And so that's one of the big questions churches really just want to nail down, their sense of uniqueness and their sense of identity. Second one is actually really practical. It's not the sexiest conversation in the church world. A lot of pastors don't wake up every morning wondering about their governance and their bylaws, but it's actually a critical question. Do we need to address issues related to our governance structure? And when I talk about governance, I'm talking about bylaws, policies, and then just precedent, the way churches go about doing their business. John, there's only really 2 times when a church will actually care what their bylaws say. Mm-hmm. It's when they are either forming them or restructuring them, rewriting them, or if I don't like the decision that was made, if I was on the losing end of a vote for a major decision, and I'm frustrated, then I want to go to the bylaws and make sure we follow policy. And so really it's when we're writing bylaws or when I'm on the losing side of a vote, that's typically the only times that churches really care, members really care about what the bylaws say. And as you can imagine, that can become a pretty sticky point when it comes to seasons of leadership transitions. And so churches that are in this intentional leadership transition process, they're asking these 2 questions and then a host of others, just to reduce risk, so that things that have nothing to do with the transition don't become things that actually undermine the process once they start going through the season of change.
Yeah, governance, bylaws, all that. I get into those conversations, and I even had one pastor the other day, or actually recently, I asked him about his bylaws, and he said, "What are those?"
Yeah.
Had to explain incorporation documents and got him. Oh, yeah. And he understood very quickly.
Yeah. Was that a church plant? Was that a new church, or was that a pretty established church?
A small established church that just, they were Hispanic congregation.
Yeah.
And so that was something that was maybe foreign to them.
Yeah. Well, it's not just only in a minority church or a church that doesn't speak English. I was actually in a meeting with a former president of the Southern Baptist Convention, with he and his key leaders, just thinking through some issues down the road. They're probably 7 to 8 years away from needing to transition. Talked about the issue of bylaws. John, they don't have any. And this is a guy who was the head of a denomination.
Sure.
president of a denomination. And so it's not just small churches that really deal with this issue. It really is church and bylaws. It really is even your larger churches and leaders that have been around for a while. I was 3 years ago, I was working with a church in Pennsylvania, and this question came up, and that church actually spent the next 18 months, really about 13, 14 months, actually going through a process of rewriting their bylaws. And so because they had the time, they could take their time in the process and they weren't rushed. And so they were able to take that time because they were just getting ahead of the conversation and being able to proactively navigate and really spend some thoughtful time and energy and building a set of documents that will serve them well.
Sure. Okay, so I think we made it through 2 of the 5 questions. One of the next questions, I'm going to throw the question at you. What impact will the transition have on our giving?
Yeah, it's great. It's a common, just kind of the general rule of thumb. Bob Russell mentions this in his book, Transition Plan. You see this referenced in other resources, but when a church goes through a season of leadership transition, especially when the retiring pastor is a long tenured, trusted leader, maybe he's the founding leader, he is the spiritual father of the congregation. There's a lot of trust there. A lot of times it's not uncommon for a certain contingent within the congregation to just really take a wait and see attitude, both in their giving, but also in their volunteerism. And they just want to wait to see if they quote unquote like the new guy, right? And so they start voting with their dollars or their lack of dollars. It's not uncommon even for healthy transitions to see anywhere from a 15 to 20% dip in giving during that time. And so part of the process here is how do we communicate what's going on? How can we develop a plan? How can we bring our financial leaders along in the conversation? And then just even the regular Joe givers that people that are new to the church and maybe they're not fully committed tithers, but maybe they're dropping in a 20 every week or two. And there's biblical precedent for that as well, John. You look at one of the capital campaign guys like to use 1 Chronicles 29 as a go-to reference for capital campaign. It's when David was raising the resources to build the tabernacle or build the temple. But if you actually, that really the broader piece of scripture there, 1 Chronicles 22 through chapter 29. But if you look in 29 verse 1, David says, hey, Solomon is my successor and he's inexperienced. And so what does David do? He leverages his influence with his peer group in the nation of Israel to raise the resources. And so it's the same kind of idea when leaders get ahead of this conversation. They actually have a pretty unique opportunity to posture this season of transition as an opportunity to invest in the future. So, one of my churches I'm working with now, they actually launched a capital campaign as part of their transition process. And the results initially have just been incredible. It's been the best financial initiative they've ever had, which is counterintuitive that you would launch a capital campaign, that a senior leader, founding pastor would launch a capital campaign in a season where he's getting ready to step aside. But it's gone incredibly well because they've got ahead of it. They've been able to communicate what's going on with the transition overall. The people have trusted the process. They've seen the wisdom in the process, and they're investing in it, and they're investing in their future and their future leader as well. And so you don't have to experience a dip, but the key there is you need to get ahead and plan and be a part of the conversation and lead people in how to think about and invest in a season of transition. And that just takes time and thought and careful attention to detail.
Yeah, I would think that an intentional leadership transition is going to bring a lot of clarity to the discussion. Mm-hmm. There's going to be clearer communication, which then in turn will have benefits to maybe not have a lack in giving because you've been clear. This has been talked about. It's been front of mind.
Yeah.
It has been, we have a communication strategy. It's not like, oh no, we're talking about this leader. Oh no, he's leaving.
Yeah.
He wants to retire. And really even the fifth question, which I'm going to skip and go from skipping the fourth one, but how can we ensure the successor starts well? Well, all of that, because it's intentional, it's clear. I just think that plays into being intentional, being strategic, and saying, we're going to talk about this. I've seen in the business world when we don't talk about this and we don't know what's the right, what are we doing? What are we doing? And that would have adverse effects, I would think, for church in their process forward.
Yeah, well, I mean, recent history, when we look at transitions, the predominant thought out there is that transitions don't go well. There's a lot of groupthink out there, and there's some real significant misnomers about how to go about transitioning well. And so, if the dominant thought is transitions don't go well, then pastors and ministry leaders are really afraid to be proactive in this conversation, when in reality, being proactive in this conversation is one of the most important things you can do to help ensure a healthy transition. The underlying principle there with an intentional leadership transition is, transitions take place in the broader context of something, in a broader environment. And it really is the broader environment, the health of that broader environment, that determines the health and impacts the health of the transition. Mm-hmm. So if the culture of the church is healthy, the transition tends to be healthy. If the culture of the church is deficient in some area, then the transition will be deficient in some area. And so having these succession planning as intentional leadership transitions, really, another way to think about it is, we want to be these are ministry leaders that are very intentional about ensuring the health of the environment, the organizational, the broader ecosystem that the transition takes place in, and they're spending time ahead of time making sure that there's health in the organization, so that when it's time for them to transition, then it goes a long way in ensuring the health of the transition itself.
Sure. Okay, there was a fourth question we didn't talk about. What is the best way to involve our people in the process? So as you go through intentional leadership transition, obviously the staff is getting a lot. You're going through an intentional process.
Yeah.
How do you involve the people in the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really is contextual in the church, but some very practical things. Kind of alluded one earlier is, a practical thing you can do is involve people by doing something like a capital campaign, or you can do something where seeing churches that are very intentional about cleaning up their database in a season of transition, and so those are very practical things, ways people can be involved, but also just in the planning process. Mm-hmm. I was at one church. Is pretty incredible to watch. The entire lobby had this paper mission. I don't know. It was just a big, massive roll of paper they rolled out and stuck to the wall, and they put a timeline of the church. And the leadership went through and marked key significant events. There was the church started on this date. There was a relocation here. There was a relocation here. This pastor was hired here. This pastor was hired here. But what they did is they asked people to go along and write their names on significant moments, like when they became a Christian, or when their marriage was healed. And what happened in this lobby over a period of several months is they were going kind of through this process of looking backwards and preparation of looking forwards. It became this living wall of redemptive storytelling. It's a very practical thing to get people involved in just remembering the faithfulness of God as they dream about where God's taking them. But another thing, focus groups, evaluating certain ministry areas, taking on specific initiatives just in a short term, just to kind of capture the imagination and the heart and the movement of people. There's really so many ways to involve the congregation at large, just to keep them engaged in the process, to help them speak into the process. Mm-hmm. It's not uncommon to do leader gatherings with people just to present information and get feedback, and just create feedback loops with people and say, hey, as a leadership team, these are things we're thinking about. We want to present that to you. Let us know what questions that you still have that we didn't answer. Is there anything we're missing that we haven't accounted for? And again, it's just this idea of, instead of letting the transition happen to our people, involving appropriately the people in the process and giving them a chance to be heard, to speak into. And you can do that in some very intentional and deliberate ways that really does capture the engagement of people as you prepare for a season of transition.
Sure. Okay, well, let's talk about the second critical conversation. That's succession planning as emergency transition management.
Yeah. So I've been in situations where we talk to churches, church leadership that, in reality, they're saying succession planning, but what just happened to them? They're talking about leadership transition. They're using the word succession planning, but at the end of the day, what happened is they just got blindsided by something, whether it be the unexpected death of a founding pastor, whether it be a moral failure that came to light and they had to deal pretty harshly with it, or a client that I'm working with currently that their pastor, they're in the process of a capital campaign, pretty significant renovation. Their pastor took a call to another church, and so the guy that led him into the capital campaign and renovation is now leaving to go somewhere else. And so we could be blindsided, and we can be forced into unexpected transitions for lots of different reasons. And that's really what I'm talking about in the article when I say succession planning as emergency transition management. I've talked to so many pastors, John. I'm sure you've run across this as well with working with church leaders, where it's the proverbial question of, "Hey, pastor, what happens if you get hit by a bus?" And so many times they reference this secret name inside a sealed envelope that's under lock and key somewhere. That's really not planning. At Auxano, again, we say that hope isn't a management strategy, and so just thinking that putting a name somewhere or not planning at all, that really does put the church in a bad way. And I estimate that somewhere around 80% of the decisions that need to be made in the wake of an unexpected transition or emergency transition situation can actually be made ahead of time with some careful thought and preparation. It's not something that takes a lot of time to do, and it's something that can be just incorporated into an annual process that key staff go through and boards or elders or deacon bodies go through. It's some very practical, simple, just ways to be proactive to prepare for the unexpected. And again, the goal in that proactive process is to remove the amount of decisions that need to be made after an emergency has taken place. That way, when we're faced with an emergency situation and emotions are high, people are frustrated, or people are mourning, whatever the situation is, we just want to make as many decisions ahead of time to prepare for that, and so we can navigate those seasons a little more effectively.
Well, I tell you, pastors and church leaders, I really hope that you hear this at that point, that to make this a part of your annual process, just kind of go through a what if, what would we do? How would we go through this? Thinking through it. Again, it goes back to an intentional process. But your pastor may not be getting ready to leave. He may not think he's going to, but you know what? None of us are guaranteed tomorrow, right?
That's right.
So, boy, Will, sharing that and really setting that as a part of an annual process, just to say, hey, this is what we would do in this case. And it doesn't even have to probably even say, well, in case pastor has a moral failure. No, if something unforeseen happens, this is how we go about it.
Yeah.
That is such a wise, it's great wisdom. And I hope a lot of people will start to put that into their yearly review, kind of like they put their budget review every year, right?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, let's talk about succession planning as ongoing leadership development.
Yeah. Most secular organizations use the phrase succession planning almost exclusively as a reference to their process of identifying and developing employees that have potential for increased levels of responsibilities. Leadership development in a nonprofit context is generally weighted towards equipping volunteers to manage various aspects of program implementation. Could be for larger church staffs. It could actually be to identify skill gaps and help invest in just training and ongoing personal development of their employees. But this idea is how do we go about in an intentional way building the people in our culture. In Auxano, we have a pretty specific process for this called our leadership pipeline. We actually send churches through a pretty intensive process to help create a systematic way to build and equip volunteers and staff to really just grow personally. But this conversation, when pastors and leaders, when they're talking to when pastors are talking with lay leaders and they mention the word succession planning, this is one of those areas where we can be having two different conversations where the business professional that's on the board or that is an elder and they think about succession planning, they're thinking about bench strength development because that's what they're thinking about primarily in their secular employment context. And so this is one we talk about training and equipping people within the congregation. In the church, out of all the industries out there, out of all the types of organizations out there, the church should be the leader, the thought leader, and the practice leader in how to develop people. I mean, after all, we point people to a growing relationship of the God whose image that humans bear. And so the opportunity for us to connect people in their identity really is a special opportunity. It should be ingrained into the culture of every ministry out there.
That is excellent. The first time I encountered succession planning was a businessman who was really had that on his heart that, hey, in the business world, we need to be, he was a baby boomer who said, hey, we need to be looking at who's going to be the next the businesses. He said, you know what? I don't think the church considers this very much. And for him, it was top of mind in the business world, but he was noticing just from he wasn't a, elder in a church or anything, but he said, I just don't think the church is even looking at this topic. And as you talked about in early 2007, not many people were talking about this. Now it's become quite a hot topic to talk about. And I think what you just laid out there would be it's just great wisdom.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point too, John. It's not uncommon for business people. And I've heard some variation of what I'm about to say in a lot of conversations, especially when there are lay leaders who are high level leaders in their organizations or they serve, and then they're also serving in the church. But, if a CEO, I actually heard a CEO say this. They said, hey, if I get hit by a bus on Tuesday, by next Monday, we're going to have a new CEO in place. Mm. And so when confronted and they observe the pace at which churches find successors to pastors who go away, and they're applying their business mentality and all this bench investment they have into building leaders, they're trying to transpose that thinking into a church, and there's a fundamental disconnect in how business leaders understand transition management in churches, where some principles are very similar. There are some significant differences, and I'll give you a very practical difference. In a church setting, a pastor and a leadership team really meet most pastors meet with their leadership teams, their lay leadership teams, on average once a month. But let's just presume for a second that a senior pastor is meeting with their elders or their deacons on a weekly basis to talk about strategy and stuff in the church, which isn't happening anywhere, but let's just be generous with that. By the time a church meets with its leadership, the pastor meets with its leadership 52 times, that's 12 months, that's 1 year. Mm-hmm. By the time a CEO meets with his strategic leadership team 52 times, it's the middle of March. It's business people employ a team to assess risk. They employ teams of people to evaluate and minimize disruption in their businesses. They invest, they hire HR professionals, they hire people who understand the industries that they're in, or on top of legislation and all that stuff. Very few churches, even large churches, actually hire an HR professional. They're hiring ministry people, and so there doesn't tend to be a steady, disciplined approach to risk management. So when seasons of transition come and risk is exposed, churches have to go find that skill set outside of their staff to be able to navigate it. And so this whole idea of ongoing leadership development, when we have business leaders that are in ministry context and they're thinking in terms of their business and their access to resource and skill set in their companies, many churches just don't have that. And so churches do move slower in these conversations, but it's not because pastors can't or aren't willing to address it. It's just really so many times this conversation's outside of their wheelhouse and what their available access to human capital is. So it just takes a little bit more time.
What you're sharing here, Will, this is exactly why the Pastor Cast, it's why we do the Pastor Cast. This is a business, really comes from a business background, but it is so applicable to the church. It is so necessary for the church to do this, to steward these seasons well. And so if people aren't thinking about this and being proactive, then they're going to be behind the eight ball, and it really lots of ministry opportunities can be lost if you do not think about this. So I'm just so glad this is going to wrap up as one of the greater Pastor Casts of the year. So there's a lot of great content here. Let's go to the next one. The succession planning is proactive exit preparation. I think I just said proactive a minute ago.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if that was on purpose or not.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that.
Yeah, again, I'll make a comparison into the business world over to the church world. Exit planning in a business context, the discipline of exit planning a lot of times deals with valuation of the business, the asset that's being sold or being transitioned out. A lot of those conversations deal with estate planning. They deal with some conversation related to a liquidity event where the business is sold, or there's some type of transition of ownership structure. And the big idea there is somebody's built their lifetime building a business. Now they're going to sell it, and they're going to get this stockpile of money, and now they're going to go do the thing that they're really passionate about. When it comes to church, however, or nonprofits, the leaders have given their life to do something that they're passionate about. Mm-hmm. So we're in a secular employment, people, they love what they do, but they're looking to give back in seasons of retirement after they've sold an asset or made a lot of money. Or ministry and nonprofit, that people give their lives to the pursuit of a cause that they're deeply passionate about. So to try and envision what they do next, and for many of them, it's very difficult. Actually, earlier today, John, I was on the phone with a pastor. It's been a client now for several months. He's been a friend for a couple of years, but he's been a client for several months. It has been a very, very emotional process for he and his wife to get to the point where they can envision what their future looks like once he transitions away from his current church. And literally today, after almost 9 months of this conversation, was the first time that I have heard him speak about his future with excitement and hope, because he's just had to go through a personal process. Mm-hmm. So in the church world, when we talk about succession planning as proactive exit preparation, we're talking about really two categories. One is this personal identity issue when we help leaders wrestle with their spouses, not independent. I mean, it's not just the retiring pastor, it's the retiring pastor and their spouse. Mm-hmm. We help them process what does it look like for them to envision their future in a different role than what they currently have. And sometimes it just takes a while for leaders to process through the emotional weight of that. But Peter Drucker, he said that, and not that I'm one to argue with Peter Drucker, the father of modern day management theory, but he made the statement that succession planning is the last greatest thing a leader does. And that one thing, I'm going to have to disagree with him. I don't think succession planning is the last great thing a leader does. I think succession planning for a pastor is their gateway to their greatest season of influence. Mm. The problem is so many times pastors, they can't envision ministry beyond the pulpit or beyond the role that they play. But that what they don't realize is that on the other side of that, if they transition well, their influence catapults and it expands to areas they've never considered before.
Okay, I'm going to stop you. That's a tweetable statement. Succession planning is the gateway to a
group of leaders influence. So succession planning Succession planning is the gateway to a leader's greatest season of influence.
Boom. That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
We'll make sure we share that out.
Okay. Yeah, so that's one thing, is just helping a leader envision what their next season of influence looks like, which isn't easy. It's not easy for them. They've been designing their experience and living and serving, and so the idea of doing something else, it's a process. The second conversation that we have with this idea of succession planning as proactive exit preparation has to deal with financial preparedness. A pretty significant reason why pastors delay the succession planning conversation, John, is simply they're not financially ready to retire. They have, because the leadership of the church, the deacons, the elders, the board, whoever, because they're not getting ahead of this conversation, they're not talking about just the financial realities. Many pastors, they don't make what it takes to lead a congregation in many cases is equivalent to running a small business. And business owners make money. If they're successful, they make a lot of money. Pastors don't. They don't make what they could make as the counterpart role in a secular employment. And so many of them live sacrificially, that they're just not prepared financially to retire. They don't have 10% every year they can set away, and they don't have matching contributions, and they don't have stock options, and they don't have deferred compensation structures. They don't have all of these things. There's not a buyout at the end of it. Talking with a couple of years ago, started a conversation with a national ministry. It's a parachurch organization. It's many of the listeners that are hearing this podcast have probably listened to this radio personality at some point on the radio, where they have read some of his books. And this guy's built a phenomenal ministry. Very profitable ministry. They make a lot of money. They reinvest that in the mission. But they're 10 years or so away from his transition, and they're thinking, how can we help our founding leader? What can we do to honor them in retirement, and how can we create a financial compensation structure to where he doesn't have to worry in retirement? And so they're having that conversation 10 years out, and it's not just him. It's their senior leadership team. How can we begin setting money, making preparation so that when they retire, they don't have to worry about their income and where they get paychecks, because there's not a stock plan out there. How can they prepare for that? And so finances, there's different ways churches will go about helping a pastor prepare, or ministry leader prepare financially, but proactive exit preparation for nonprofit entities, specifically parachurch ministries and churches, tend to revolve around two conversations. One is financial preparation, and number two is, what is the leader's role post-retirement? What is their next season of influence?
Good. All right, I want us to wrap up here on the last one, succession planning as new leader hiring. And you talk about here in this, and I want you to process this a little bit further, that churches need to have a language that allow the succession conversation to shift from a search to an intentional leadership transition.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. One of the, like I said, I've been talking about the topic of succession planning has been on my radar since 2007. And so for a long time in the church world, where in the secular world, leadership development tends to dominate the succession planning conversation. Mm-hmm. In the church world, it's actually search, where a lot of times leadership, deacons, elders, boards of trustees, they view, when they hear succession, what they're interpreting in the back of their brain is search, which is very viable. There is no success in succession without a successor. At some point, you have to identify who is going to take the reins and lead in the next season of the organization's history. That's being written. But to the worst, one of the biggest challenges when it comes to helping a leadership team navigate and really press into this conversation of succession planning is when a leadership team goes to the search conversation, automatically what happens, just my experience over and over and over again, when that conversation is brought up, what happens is we ignore the other questions that need to be addressed. And so issues related to how do we evaluate the environmental health of the transition? What can we do to help our current leader transition to their next season of influence? What can we do to think through and be proactive about how we manage the unforeseen? What can we do today? All of those questions that are really important questions get set aside when we start the process of coming up with a profile and search. And think about this, John. You're several years away from retirement, but let's say I was on the board at Service Realty, and we were coming into a season. It's time for you to retire, or whatever. That's a very personal conversation. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult for boards or second chair leaders to go to their leader, to the senior person in the organization, whether it's sacred or secular, and have a succession planning conversation if the underlying definition is search. That's really confronting a leader with their shelf life in the organization. And a lot of guys just really struggle with that being the starting point of the conversation. So one of the reasons why, where we talked about earlier, where pastors aren't financially ready, or they can't envision what their future looks like, so it causes them to delay the succession planning conversation. But another reason that causes them to delay talking about succession planning is because in the back of their mind, they're interpreting it as search, and they're not ready to talk about finding the person that's going to replace them. And so one of the reasons why, again, just pressing in, writing this document and trying to bring some articulation to the different conversations around succession planning is, my experience is, if we can go to ministry leaders and we can facilitate a succession planning conversation that is not centered around the search conversation, but we can shift it and say, hey, pastor, at some point, someday, you're going to transition. We're not looking for your successor today. We're not talking about search, but what can we do to help you begin to plant seeds for your next season of influence? What can we do financially? What can we do to help you dream about your next season? What can we do to make sure that the organization is healthy enough and address issues that exist today? And let's not defer that to the next guy. Let's go ahead and be proactive in addressing and evaluating organizational health. That shifts the conversation. Again, my experience, I've found that leaders have been very willing to embrace those conversations when it's not postured through the idea of search. But the reality of it is, part of the succession planning conversation does have to do with hiring a new person, and we have to be willing to talk about that. It just helps to facilitate a process, and it helps to even engage the senior leader whose transition we're talking about. It helps them if we can classify and clarify the conversation so everybody knows what we're talking about, and we can lead with something else other than search.
Sure. Well, as we've been chatting through each of these critical conversations, they're great conversations. One of the things that hit me is that an established church, a church that's been around, maybe they've had a season of influence for the last 50, 60 years, and maybe their senior leader, maybe they've already transitioned. Maybe the new leader is now 50 or 45 years old. But maybe the children's minister that's been there for 30 years is ready to transition. And maybe they need to go through this. Maybe the leadership needs to say, let's apply these principles with a senior leader like that, because that person could have great influence on that church if they've been there for that length of period of time.
Yeah, John, I'm working with a church like that right now. They've got 6 senior key leaders over the age of 62, the youngest of which is the senior pastor. In 4 years, he will be at the church for 40 years. It's a church that runs 4,500 or more people in average worship attendance. And so, it's a pretty big ministry, but it's not just the senior pastor we're having to plan for. We've got a significant season of leadership transition coming for this church. So it's for, in many cases, it's not just the senior pastor. It's other key leaders that we are really helping set the environment so that we can navigate multiple transitions. It's a very, very great point, John.
It has a huge impact on ministry, on the people that are serving, the people that have been there, the people who aren't there yet. Again, all of this is for those who aren't here yet, who haven't heard the gospel, who haven't been influenced yet, but so that this church does not lose influence in a season of transition.
Yeah.
They can not miss those opportunities.
Yeah, it's for the people that aren't there yet, obviously, but it's also, John, for the people who are there and who have been faithful servants. Mm-hmm. Those ministry leaders that have been in place for a long time, they are the spiritual mothers and fathers of the congregation, and they've held people's hands and cried with them in low points. They have buried their dead. They have celebrated new birth. They've been at weddings. They've been at divorces. They've been at, they've walked and shepherded life with people. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just the senior pastor transition that causes angst. It is that long tenured children's pastor. It is the worship pastor that is beloved, and it is the missions director that has led people and exposed people to what God is doing in other continents. It is the youth pastor that's transitioning, not a retirement-based transition, but it's a youth pastor who has loved on my junior high and high school kid, and now he's getting a call to become a pastor somewhere else, and he's leaving. It is, it's so many transitions that happen throughout the organizational structure, and in churches, candidly, churches just don't tend to handle staff transitions very well. And man, the people of God deserve for their leaders to navigate and steward seasons of transitions better than we typically do. And it's just, so much attention falls on the senior pastor around this topic of succession planning, but really we're talking about transition management at various levels within the organization and making sure that there is continuity through transition so that people are respected and engaged in the process, and that leaders are treated equitably and respectfully as they try to navigate their seasons of transition. Sure.
Well, this is great stuff. We will share the original blog post that we've been chatting about today. Also, if you're listening to this and you're saying we need to have this conversation, you need to contact Will. His email is willheath@auxano.com. That's spelled AUXANO.com. And so I want you to please reach out to Will. You can also find him on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle?
It's at Willard Heath, WILLARD Heath, HEATH, at Willard Heath. And then again, my email is willheath, WILL Heath, HEATH, at Auxano.com. Would love to hear from you and serve your church and your ministry in any way we can.
Well, he'll drop some wisdom on you every day on Twitter. So, not his wisdom, but the good Lord's wisdom from Proverbs. He's pretty faithful at doing that. So, Will, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, man. It's always a pleasure, John.
Yeah, we'll look forward to having you again. And we'll just want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, and we'll talk to you in 2017.
Bye.